Welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. Today we have a guest I've been looking forward to interview for some time, Eric Flint. As for his intro, I'm going to take a really big breath and have at it. He received a master's in history from UCLA. Despite those academic credentials, he spent the next quarter of a century as an activist in the American trade union movement, working as a longshoreman, truck driver, auto worker, steel worker, oil worker, meatpacker, glassblower, and machinist. Eric's writing career began with his first place win in Writers of the Future, Volume 9 in 1993 with his story, Entropy and the Strangler. He then went on to write his science fiction novel, Mother of Demons, in 1997. He has co-authored novels with David Drake, Dave Freer, and Mercedes Lackey. His alternate history novel, 1632, was published in 2000, has led to a long-running series with many novels and anthologies in print. He's written a number of science fiction and fantasy novels and now has more than 60 novels in print, as well as many pieces of short fiction and dozens of anthologies, which he's edited. He was also the editor of the online science fiction and fantasy magazine, Jim Baen's Universe. Eric is also the publisher of Ring of Fire Press and the Grantville Gazette electronic magazine. He became a Writers of the Future judge in 2010. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
So, with all that background, how did becoming a writer enter into your plan of future for your life?
Well,
how did you decide?
I actually started there. I was writing science fiction beginning when I was 13 years old. And I wrote a fair amount as a teenager. Many years ago, I lost it years ago, but I had a handwritten 2-page rejection letter from John Campbell for a story I sent in when I was 15 or 16, I've forgotten which. And I continued to write in college, but then once I left college, I got politically active in the trade union movement, and that was kind of all-consuming. So I just basically stopped writing for about 25 years. There were a couple of brief stretches where I'd go back and do some writing, but for the most part, I really didn't do much writing between the ages of early 20s and mid 40s. And then when I got in my mid 40s, for one thing, the life of a political actor is pretty tiring. For one thing, you're always broke. And I just decided that the one thing I'd always wanted to do, going all the way back, was be a writer. And I had one novel in particular that I'd started and really thought a lot about. And I just didn't want to be on my deathbed and regret the fact that I never tried to finish it. So I started writing again. And the story I submitted to the contest is actually an episode in that novel. It wound up being published in a companion novel, but it was part of the same story. And I looked at it and figured that if I sort of nipped and tucked around the edges, I could turn into a pretty good short story. So that's what I sent in, and that won first place in the winter quarter of 92 in the Writers of the Future contest. And that's actually how my career got started. It was then published in the volume 9 of every year the Writers of the Future contest comes out with a new volume. And I was in the 9th volume, which came out in 1993. I then finished the novel that I had wanted to finish, the one that I based the story was a part of. And by then I had an agent because she, partly because winning the contest gave me credentials, and also she just liked the novel, but she warned me it was going to be hard to sell because it's a peculiar book. It's hard to describe. It's kind of a surrealistic fantasy. And
is that the first one you published? Is that the one that the Mother Demons?
No. That Mother Demons. I'll explain. Mother Demons is actually the second novel I wrote. The first novel became Well, it became two novels eventually. One of them was Philosophical Strangler, and the other was Ford the Mage. The short story that I submitted to the contest wound up being the preface to my novel, The Philosophical Strangler, which is actually where I'd always intended it to be. It's just, in any event, what happened was I was getting quite a few rejections, and they were kind of odd rejections. It wasn't so much that people didn't like the novel; it's just that it didn't suit anybody, which didn't surprise me because it really is an oddball book. And so I eventually told my agent, Shauna McCarthy, I said, Shauna, just take it off the market because there's no point just racking up rejection notices. And in the meantime, I'd written a straightforward science fiction novel, which was Mother of Demons. I wrote that in the fall of '93. Actually, right after coming back from the contest ceremony, I started working on it, and that was actually the first book I sold. Was Mother of Demons, and that came out in 1997, in September of '97. So that was actually my second novel that I wrote was the first one I sold, which is a point I make to new writers is the best way to get published is just keep writing because you really don't know what's going to strike or what's not. So
Right.
don't get obsessed with your first book. Just write it, send it in, and then go. If you can write one novel, you can write a second one. Anyway, that's how my career got started. It got started with the contest, and and then it went from there, of course. But that is where it got started.
Oh, good. So now, when you went to the workshop and the awards event, anything in particular that stands out as memory of it, either friendships made
I never
or?
was able to go to the workshop, John. The problem was back in those days. You guys changed it, but back in those days, you were moving around the time of the award.
Yeah.
For many years now, it's been set at a particular time, but in those days, it was moving around, and I was, I was working in a factory, and factory jobs, you don't just take a week off. I mean, you got to put in for it well ahead of time, and it's based on seniority, et cetera, et cetera. And Dave Wolverton was the coordinator of the contest, and I said to Dave, I need to know what week you guys are going to do it because I have to put in for my week off. And he didn't know because it hadn't been decided. So I finally said, give me your best guess. He did. That was the week I put in for my week's vacation, and then it turned out to be the wrong week. So I just wound up coming out for the ceremony on the weekend. So I never was part of the workshop.
Got it. Are any of the other winners there? Did you, for the day or two that you were there, have any of those relationships maintained since?
Oh yeah, I have remained good friends with Stoney Compton. I won first place winter quarter, and Stoney won second place. He came up to me and he said, I want to see who beat me out. Stoney and I became friends. We've been friends ever since. I actually wound up helping him get his first novel published at my publisher, Bing Books, in Russian America.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did an interview with him a couple months ago, and he talked all about you and just like how much of a friendship that built up and how you'd helped him. So
now we've been friends for what is that now? Getting close to 30 years, and I now I actually publish several of his books as a publisher. So Stoney, I have remained in touch ever since. The one other person, I'm not in regular contact with him, but I do run into him periodically, or used to before the pandemic at conventions, is he's become a well-known writer. He's Australian, named Sean Williams. And I've been in touch. I've run into Sean. The other,
He's a judge too now for Writers of the Future as well, like yourself.
Okay, yeah. And other than that, I had contact with a few of the other people for a while, but it's been a long time. I mean,
for sure.
back in,
I was just curious because a lot of the winners have said that they make friends that last for their for lifetime friends. So I was just curious how that played with yourself.
Estonian has been. It's lasted ever since, and to some degree with Sean. But and over the years, I just lost touch with the other people.
Yeah, understood. Now, one of the things that you do a lot of writing of is alternate history. Now, obviously, you have your master's in history, and I'm assuming that had a lot to do with it. And reading 1632, the fact that you were so involved with unions and then all the different trades you were part of, and they shine bright in your story. How did you come up with that? And was that by design, or did you just kind of like trip over it?
That particular story, that novel, 1632, which then spawned a huge sprawling series, it's set in northern West Virginia. I lived there for about a year and a half back in the late 70s. And I was active in the trade union movement there. That's actually where I worked as a glassblower, which was kind of an interesting experience. It's kind of died out now in that part of West Virginia, but when I was there, it was still active. It was very old-fashioned kind of glassblowing. But I got to know the area quite well, and it struck me in the back of my mind, I didn't really think much about it, that one of those small, they're very working class towns, mostly coal miners, would make a really great collective protagonist in a story. But I could never figure out the story until many, many, many years later. I just wound up doing research for another book, which wound up actually never getting written. But I wound up doing research on the 30 Years' War, which I hadn't studied since college. And it struck me that setting would be perfect for that town, that type of town. So that's how the thing got started. I have a lot of experience with that calm working class people who don't usually appear much in science fiction, and they appear much more often in the books I write. As far as the history goes, I majored in history. I was shooting for a PhD. I wound up deciding not to. I was at the stage they call ABD, all but dissertation. And I just decided at that point, after 3 years of grad school, that I kind of lost. I had planned on becoming a college professor, but I just wasn't interested enough anymore, so I left. But I retained my interest in history. That hasn't changed at all. And so I wound up, my first novel, Mother of Demons, is a science fiction novel, but if you look closely at it, it's kind of an alternate history. And about half the plot is based on episodes in the history of Bantu Southern Africa in the 18th century, which is what I specialized in. Of course, Americans don't know anything about it. My friend Dave Freer was born and raised in South Africa. He recognized it. So I just wound up using, even when I write science fiction, there's always a very strong historical aspect or component to what I write. And one of the things I like to joke about is that a history degree is considered financially one of the most useless degrees you can possibly get. But I've done quite well.
You have indeed, but you've taken it and used it.
Yeah, I mean, I've done fine with it, which just goes to show you really can't predict where your life's going to go. But in any event, that's my historical interest and background shows up all the time in all kinds of different ways in books that I write. Sometimes directly, other times just indirectly. You don't see it necessarily on the surface, but it's there underneath.
Yes. Now, when I'm checking on research before this interview, there was a comment made about the similarity between Mark Twain's The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. Did that have any influence on you, or was that something that you'd read earlier that kind of like made a connection?
Not really. I'd read it, and I quite enjoyed it. But it's a type of alternate history, but it's also fantasy. And the book, The Alternate History, had a much greater impact on me in terms of shaping my own career later on. Was actually another one of the great classics is L. Sprague de Camp's Less Darkness,
right.
which is a novel about an archaeologist who De Camp did exactly what I did. You just come up with a MacGuffin to explain the time travel event, and and it's like, just take my word for it, it happened. I came up with a 4-page explanation involving a kind of cosmic catastrophe. He didn't even bother with that. He just had a lightning bolt strike the guy, and the next thing that happens is the guy looks around and he's in Rome in the 6th century, after the barbarian conquest. The Goths are running Rome now. And it's exactly the same period starring Belisarius. And I wound up writing an alternate history of years later based around Belisarius, not taking place in Italy. But
that's a whole series that you wrote, right?
Yeah, with David Drake. It's called the Belisarius series. There's 6 volumes in it. Yeah, that was early in my career.
Yeah.
Belisarius has always been an historical figure that's done very well in science fiction. He was the model for Isaac Asimov's Bel Rios in the Foundation trilogy. He's kind of such a fascinating historical figure that several science fiction writers have used him at one time or another. But it was really much more Sprague de Camp's novel than Twain's. Twain's is a lot of fun, but partly it's comedy and partly it's kind of fantasy. And whereas what de Camp wrote was much more straightforward. I mean, it was just there's a time travel event. This guy, he's just an archaeologist. I mean, he's Mouse Padway is what he's called. He's not any kind of hero. He just happens to know a lot. And he winds up back, 1,500 years earlier in history, and he starts having a real impact on history. And that's more the kind of thing I do. Okay,
I get that. Now, one thing that I'm not sure if it was something that you wrote on your website, but there's the fan involvement for helping to direct future points or aspects of the 1632 series. How does that fit in? How have you used your fans' input and stuff to help?
Well, the way that happened was that when I started writing 1632, I was discussing it with my publisher, Jim Bain, and I said that one of the problems is that you have to know all kinds of things that are not necessarily related to each other. And the amount of research was looking awfully daunting to me. And Jim suggested, because Bain Books had then, still does, a very active website of its own where fans would come and talk about books. So Jim suggested, he said, why don't we create a conference we'll call 1632 Tech and just throw out to people your questions and get input from the fans and help from them. So I thought it was a great idea, so I started doing it. And then what I discovered was the best way to do it was, as I wrote a chapter, I would post it in Bain's Bar, as it's called, and get reactions from fans, including one of the reactions is if they spotted something I'd said that was incorrect, they'd correct me and say, no, it doesn't work that way, do it this way. So right from the beginning, there was people got really interested in it. So we wound up having hundreds of people participating in it. And that's how I wrote that first book. I mean, it was you had this constant daily, weekly fan involvement with the book. one thing it did was it boosted sales enormously. I mean, that book,
Oh, no doubt.
that book did really well because there was a built-up audience waiting for it when it came out.
Yeah.
But it also generated this huge amount of fan interest, and a lot of people were sort of kicking around story ideas of their own. So I discussed with Jim Bain. I wrote the first novel myself, and then David Weber and I wrote the second novel together, 1633. And that boosted it even further because David is a very well-known science fiction author. And then what I suggested to Jim was we do an anthology of short fiction set in the series, but we do something very unusual. We would commission about half the stories from established authors. A sort of traditional invitation-only anthology, but we would open the other half of it to submissions from fans. But they'd have to do it through Bain's website. I didn't want to have people sending stuff over the transom who had no knowledge of what the series was. So we got about over 100 stories submitted that way, and I selected 8 or 9 of them, and we wound up publishing them in that first Ring of Fire anthology. And the anthology sold extremely well. And people kept writing fan fiction. And, I looked at that and I suggested to Jim, I said, would you like to try the experiment of creating an electronic magazine where we would publish fan fiction, and we'd pay people. And he said he thought it was an interesting idea, but he didn't want to himself get involved. He'd been a magazine editor earlier in his career, and he said he just didn't want to deal with running a magazine again. So he said what he would do is he would lend me the money to set it up, and then, I'd pay it back, which is how we did it. The Granville Gazette is actually my magazine, not Bain Books. I paid Jim back a long time ago for the money he lent me. And
right.
We started, originally we were just publishing them on an occasional basis. And there was no regular publication schedule, and we were paying on a semi-pro basis. We were paying people money, but it wasn't rates that would meet what Science Fiction Writers Association considered professional rates. Although people did get royalties from it, and they wound up making quite a bit of money on the back end. And then after a few years in May of 2007, I decided we had enough steam going that we could turn it into an actual professional magazine. And I discussed it with Paula Goodlett, who wound up becoming my first editor. And we launched the Gazette as a real professional magazine in May of 2007. And it's been recognized by the Science Fiction Writers Association ever since as a qualifying venue. And we are now up to issue 92 or 93. I've lost track. What's interesting about it, John, is that it's to the best of my knowledge or anyone else I've ever talked to, it's the only successful literary magazine in science fiction or any other genre that's based purely on a literary property. In other words, there have been other successful magazines, but they're always based on media properties. Star Wars or Man from U.N.C.L.E. had a magazine for a while. This magazine, even Ellery Queen's magazine, there were always TV shows based on it. So it's maintained that kind of interest for, God, what is it now? 14 years or going on.
That's impressive.
What happened eventually is that Bain started reissuing. The magazine comes out 6 times a year, every 2 months, and every maybe 2.5, 3 years, Bain Books will publish a paper edition anthology of sort of the best stories from the magazine for a stretch of time. So the stuff keeps getting reissued. And as of now, the 1632 series has somewhere around 24 novels published by Bain Books. It's got 12 anthologies of short fiction, with 2 more coming out this year. And then starting a few years ago, I launched my own publishing house to handle sort of spillover, because there were long-running stories in a magazine and we just didn't have room to fit in an anthology. So
Yeah.
I wound up talking over some people, and we realized, well, we could just publish it ourselves. So that's how we set up Ring of Fire Press. And then what happened after a few years, we looked at it and said, well, we actually have a publishing house now. There's no reason we have to restrict ourselves to 1632 material. And so as of now, we are publishing a new book every week. And it's spread far beyond the 1632 series, although we still publish a lot of that. But for instance, David Brin's starting a new young adult series that he's publishing through us that'll start next month in February. And Steve Sterling's got a trilogy he's going to publish through us. And David Gerald's published a short novel through us. So, it's become a real publishing house, which is kind of an interesting experience too.
Now, is that something you're the actual publisher, or is that part of
I'm the publisher.
Bain?
I'm the publisher. It's not. Bain distributes them for me. I mean, they're one of the distributors. The main distributor is Amazon, but no, I own that. That's my wife and I. That's our publishing house, and I think we've published about 70 books by now, something like that.
Wow.
Well, we're coming out with a new one.
That's very impressive. Plus, with your writing schedule. Yeah.
So, I wound up, there are 4 major jobs on the literary side of being of publishing. There's publisher, editor, author, and agent. And I've done all 4 of them, although I've never taken money as an agent, but I have helped a number of authors basically serve them as their agent. I never took money for it. I just did it to help, the favor. Usually the people that were co-authors are friends of mine. So I've gotten to have a very well-rounded knowledge of the business.
Now, one thing that I don't want to get off before we go on the next subject here, with your 1632, like you were saying, you wanted to do something where a town, a community was a protagonist. And that was a fascinating concept, because a protagonist is usually a guy or a girl, but this is a whole community. That's brilliant, but how'd that come about?
Well, I just, I just thought of it, a town like this would just be a very impressive collective protagonist in the right circumstances. The kind of funny thing about it is that after I submitted the proposal to Jim Bain and he bought it, I was talking to David Drake, and I told David about it, and he said, have you read Steve Sterling's Island in the Sea of Time? And my heart kind of stopped. And I said, no, why? And he said, well, he kind of does the same thing with the island of Nantucket. And God, it's the great nightmare of writers. You come up with a story, then you find out someone else already done it. David assured me the stories are so different that it wouldn't be a problem. But I've talked to Steve. Steve's become a friend of mine, and he and I have talked about it. And what we both find kind of puzzling is we developed our ideas completely independent of each other. His book came out before mine did by a couple of years, but we weren't in any communication with each other. And what we can't figure out is why we're the only ones who ever did it, because it seems kind of an obvious thing to do, but for whatever reason, the 2 of us came up with basically the same idea at basically the same time. And I don't know, but there are advantages to having that kind of a collective protagonist, because you got a lot more.
An infinite amount of storylines that can develop off of that.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, too, is that part of the reason the 1632 series has so many different. It's not a series that runs seriatim the way most do, where it's book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4. There is what I call a main line to the series, which tends to follow the central characters, and you can read them that way. But the series branches out pretty early on. starting with a third book, in fact. And there are different storylines that go off in different directions, and they typically involve different characters. And it shares the same setting, and it's more than just a setting because they tend to interact. Each novel tends to have an impact on another novel. But the reason you can do it is because you're starting with a big collective protagonist. I mean, there's no way you can take 3 or 4 characters and do something like that. Without it getting ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay. Now, another area I wanted to be able to discuss with you is the whole subject of team writing, collaborations, working with other writers on your projects. So you do quite a bit of that. Yeah. What do you find as the most plus that you gain from being able to do that? What's the main advantage?
The big advantage to collaborative writing is you can write a wider range of stories than you could write on your own. To give an example, the novel I did with Reich Spoor, the first novel he and I did together, is called Boundary. And it's a science fiction novel. I had plotted that book out many years ago. It's sort of just a straightforward science fiction novel. I think of it as an Arthur Clarke type novel in the sense that, nobody shoots anybody. There's adventure and danger, but it's all just the natural risks of space exploration. It's not, shoot 'em up. The problem was that to write it properly, because it's a hard science fiction novel, the amount of research I would have had to do in fields that I'm not well versed in. History is one thing, but I'm not a scientist, and although I've always been interested in it, but I would just look at the amount of research I'd have to do to write that book, and it was just so much that I just put it aside. And then I got to know Reich, and Reich is actually an expert in imaging, which is not what I had in mind when I originally plotted it, but I realized all I had to do was shift the protagonist to being a rocket scientist to being an imaging scientist, and we could go, because Reich could fill in all that. He knew that stuff.
Right.
And there's a lot of things like that. That's kind of a sort of extreme thing where there's that much difference. But every good collaboration, your partner is going to have different interests, different skill sets. I'm never looking for a clone of me to write something. I mean, I'm looking for somebody who's got something different. And that's the big advantage, is that it broadens your range, I'll call it, a lot. The other reason I do it is psychological mostly. I'm because of the kind of work I did, for first 20, 30 years as an adult, I'm used to a social work environment. And writing, there are a lot of things I love about being a writer. Top of the list is I don't have a boss and I don't have a time clock. So I don't really consider it a job. I mean, it's work, but it's just, I'm not regimented at all. You got to work, but I mean, I set my own time, my own hours, anything I want. But basically, my job is I go down into my basement where my office is and I talk to myself all day. And, I'm not that fascinated with myself that I want to, I'm sort of used to, if you're a machinist, you're going to encounter other machinists all day, and you go to the tool crib and you shoot the breeze. It's a social environment, and I miss that. And collaborative writing gives you a fair amount of that, especially if you do as much as I do.
Yeah,
I collaborate with, God, I don't know how many people, well over a dozen. So I'm interacting constantly with lots of different people, all of whom have either started or became friends of mine in the course of it, one or the other. So it makes it, for me, emotionally a lot more satisfying work. the majority of my writing is collaborative. I will say that when I get around to writing a solo novel, and I'm about to do it again in a few months, it is a bit of a relief just because I don't have to deal with anyone else. I can just, tell the story myself. But I enjoy the fact that I have a much more social life as a writer than most writers do. It suits me better.
That's great. Now, I just wanted to go back briefly to the Writers of the Future workshop. I know you didn't attend it, but you teach it now when we have our awards weeks. So what is it you normally cover when you do your
basically, I'm not doing it the same way that Dave Farland or Tim Powers do it. They're there all week, and they're basically running the workshop. I just come in on the weekend when we when they do the award ceremony. But they asked me to give a talk every time I come out, and I basically will talk about whatever they want me to talk about. But usually, I have a really broad range of experience with this industry, more than most writers. And so they will usually ask me to talk about one or another kind of subject that hopefully will be helpful to new writers in orienting themselves. I don't know how to put it, but one of the things I found difficult, really difficult, when I started as a writer is you are so isolated that it's very hard to get a sense of what this industry, what's happening. I can remember when getting a rejection notice was kind of a relief because it proved that there were actually editors out there and the whole thing wasn't a cruel hoax. Because you really don't know what's happening. It's kind of a very opaque industry if you're a new writer, and even for established writers. And so I would just try to explain to people things that are happening and why they're happening. It's very much the same thing that Kevin Anderson and I and some other people set up, Dave Farland set up. We have our own seminar, which we do once a year, called Superstars Writing Seminar, where we're not so much teaching people how to write. What we're doing is a 3-day seminar on the business of being a writer, just to try to orient people so they understand what you're getting into. And that's usually the talk that Tim or Dave wants me to give, or something like that.
Okay, that's good, because I want people are listening to this. It's like they're gaining understanding that you're just very diverse in your experience and what you've done in writing. We've talked about novels, but on short fiction, obviously that's how I first became acquainted with you through your win in Volume 9. Now, we talked briefly before this. Your familiarity with L. Ron Hubbard's works is mostly his short fiction. Any comments about that?
I've read Hubbard off and on for many years now. I tend to prefer his short fiction to his long form for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into here. But partly, I enjoy his use of the English language. Just stylistically, I enjoy reading him, and I think you get it better into the short fiction than in long form. The problem with long form is you've got to actually be a little careful, because if you get, I don't know how to put this, if you get too stylistic with long form, you tend to wear people out. Whereas with a short story, it's people, you can do more of that. His stories also lend themselves to dramatic presentation quite well. So I've seen plays on based on one or another of his stories. A three of them I've seen at their author services. I just, he was very inventive and creative, and I enjoy the stories a lot.
So how he came about to create the Writers of the Future program in 1983. I mean, that's one thing when we've brought on all the various judges initially and then continuing to be, is just that whole purpose that he had of providing that means for the aspiring writer, and then 5 years later for the aspiring artist, for the creative efforts to be seen and acknowledged. And the anthology, comprised of newbies, basically, has remained one of the best-selling anthologies of science fiction and fantasy. So any comments about that on that aspect, and also why you became a judge back in 2010?
I became a judge because it's kind of a, it's the old story, you can't pay it back, so you pay it forward. My career got started by the contest. It, I'm hopeful that it would have gotten started anyway without it, but it would have certainly taken longer and been more difficult. One huge impact that the contest had on me. It's a little hard to explain, but there's a great difficulty when you're a new writer, because the problem is you don't have any gauge of how good you are, at least that you tend to trust. My mother always thought I wrote well. Gee, that's nice. And so did friends of mine, which is also nice. But, are they just being nice to you? You know what I mean? And winning the contest, the final judges in the year I won were Larry Niven, Jerry Pournell, Anne McCaffrey, and A.J. Budrus. And I did not know any of them. I never met them. I knew who they were. And so having 4 writers of that experience and stature, and there was never any issue that there was any personal favoritism involved. They didn't know me from Adam.
You were just a number at that time.
Right, I was just a number. I mean, they didn't know my name. They didn't know my gender. And that has a big impact. At least it did on me. And writing is like any kind of work. Self-confidence makes a big difference. It really does. And it's particularly hard as a writer because it's a trade where you don't get that. I don't know how to put this, but I was joking once with a friend of mine, and he expressed the opinion that he thought writers tended to be crazier than most people. And I said, I don't know if that's true. I said, what I think happens is that the nature of the work tends to make you a little crazy. I said, because here's what happens. If you're a normal person with a regular job, you're getting feedback from your coworkers, your boss, your subordinates, your customers every day. I mean, you're getting a constant back and forth that helps you keep yourself oriented and know how you're doing. I said, what happens when you're a writer is you're off by yourself for months, and then you produce a piece of work, and you go and hand it to somebody. And often, if it's a novel or even a short story, you wait for months or even years to hear anything. And then you get a form letter rejection. And it's enough to make you a little crazy, It's, I don't know how to put it. It's just that you're
No, that makes sense.
You're so detached from what you're doing that winning a contest like this made a hell of a difference emotionally to me. It really did. And I'm sure that if I had gotten stories published, that would have done it as well. But that could be harder. And the other problem for somebody like me is that I'm not really a short fiction writer myself. I do write short fiction, but almost all the short fiction I write is either set in one of my own settings or that of someone I work with, like David Weber. Or it's something I write on commission, usually because a friend of mine asked me if I'll write a story for an anthology they're putting together. But what I don't do is write a story and submit it to a magazine. I haven't done that in, 40 years. And I really when I was starting as a writer, I would write short fiction because everybody told me I was supposed to. And the problem I kept running into is I'd discover every time I was starting to write a short story that I was winding up writing a novel. And eventually I just said, oh, to hell with it, I'm just going to write a novel because that's really what I prefer doing. But then that makes your isolation even greater because you can write a short story in a week or two. Even if you're a fast writer like I am, a novel is going to take you months to write. So it was that kind of problem of isolation was even greater for me than I think for most people. So I was always very thankful for the contest, and I don't remember how the idea came up. I just don't remember anymore. I think I don't know if I raised it with somebody or they raised it with me, but when the possibility came up of my becoming a judge for the contest, was it back in 2010? I couldn't remember when it was. It was quite a way.
Yeah, I wrote to you and we had that conversation.
Okay. Anyway, I jumped for it right away. I thought it would be, and I'm glad I did. I mean, it's a contest I feel very supportive of and very strongly about. It's rare to find in there's no other like it in science fiction. I don't know about other genres, but by now it's certainly the premier contest of its nature in the English language, and probably in most of, I can't speak outside of English, but English is the main language of science fiction. So
yeah, we've had I think 6 winners that were where English was a second language, and then people in their Writers of the Future forum actually helped them so they could take their whatever their language is and convert it to English, and they were actually winners.
Yeah, no, we actually in the 1632 series we published several people for whom English is a second language. It's not their primary language, and it's always, I think, a little embarrassing for an American to realize how much more capable other people are picking at learning a language. Americans tend to be terrible at it. It's because we live in such a big country, so you can get by easily with just one language. I've published, Baines published a Danish author, and she writes in English is, it's not her first language. She writes in it. There are others. Anyway, so that's how I became a judge, and I've been doing it ever since. We missed last year because of the pandemic, but that, I think, with the vaccines coming along, I'm hoping that will be over.
So, with respect to an aspiring writer, because you write novels, not the short fiction particularly, how many words do you have to have under your belt before you really have your own voice established, do you think?
There's an old saying that you have to write 1,000,000 words of crap before you write anything publishable. That's not true. I calculated it for myself, and I figure I only had to write about 400, maybe 450,000 words of crap before I could start writing stuff. But it is absolutely true. There are a few exceptions. There are a few people who are just able to write well right out of the gate, but it's not true for most people. And nothing substitutes for practice, for just writing. And so the biggest advice I always give people is when you write a story, just send it off and start working on a novel. Just keep writing. Don't get obsessed with promoting your work. That's all fine. But the best way to get published is to keep writing. For one thing, you don't know what you've written is going to first strike someone, and secondly, you just get better when you do it. As far as I'm, some writers are all different. Some writers set a very definite, they will write every day and they will write 1,000 words a day, or they will write for 4 hours, whatever it is. I've never been like that. I tend to be I tend to write in spurts or bursts, however you want to put it. When I get working on a novel and I really get rolling, I will write a lot in a relatively short amount of time. But then once I'm finished, I have to take time off before I start writing something else. So that's how I work.
What's a good production day for you in terms of words output?
I don't think it's not so much words. What I try to do is write a chapter a day. And for me, the average chapter probably averages somewhere around 3,000 words. So, but it'll vary. It could be anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000, but 3,000 is probably a good average. And the reason I shoot for a chapter a day is just because that's kind of how I think. A chapter for me it's kind of a unit of its own. It's got a sort of, it's got a beginning and ending of its own, and it's a good way for me to write. And then when I get a chapter finished, usually that'll be it for the day. The one exception is sometimes I'm kind of under the gun, and I've got to make a deadline that's a little close. And in that case, I'll push for maybe a chapter and a half a day, but I'm not really that comfortable doing that. I can, but it's not what I'm really comfortable for doing. The most I've ever been able to write in one day, and I've only done this 3 or 4 times, is about 10,000 words in a day. But that's working for me like 16 hours. It's just, and it's very unusual. But typically when I get rolling on a novel, John, I shoot for a chapter a day. And the thing about it is, even a long novel is going to be 60 chapters. That's 180,000 words, which is a very long novel. And, theoretically, you can do that in 2 months if you keep plugging at it. I don't write every single day. I will take some time off. But when I am really rolling a novel, I get a lot written pretty quickly.
Okay, that's good. That's. I always like to find out from the pros to provide that a datum that other people can then compare their own production to and just see what do they do that makes them proceed on writing their novels or short stories. So that's good to be able to do that. You don't do it against word count. You do against you do a chapter a day.
You do a chapter. Here's the main thing main advice I give people is, first of all, to be a writer, you do have to be self-disciplined, because the problem with being a writer is it's the same problem that you have when you're trying to quit smoking. You know that cigarettes are killing you, and you have to quit. Well, you don't have to quit today, and with writing, it's sort of the other way around. You have to write, but you don't have to write today, and it just starts to get easy. So you have to not procrastinate, and you really do have to be self-disciplined, and you have to learn what to be careful of, because the 2 most insidious ways of procrastinating are world building and research. And you have to do both to write a successful book, but you can just keep going and going and going, and you never get around to actually writing anything. So at some point, you just got to say, enough, damn it, I'm going to put my ass down and write. The main thing I do is sit down in front of the computer and write. And what I do is I just write something, a sentence. It's just start writing, and if you start, usually you can get into it and keep going. But that's the main thing and don't let any writer tell you this is the right way to do it, because every writers are very different from each other, and they'll all have different ways of doing something. And the basic rule is just simply, if it works, fine. But just make sure it's actually working and that you're actually getting things done.
Good.
And that's about I know that's pretty vague advice, but it's about the best I can do.
Yeah. I mean, if you say something you got to do, you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, and you sit down and type the first 50 words, then you have your oatmeal, then you have your coffee, then you write another 200 words. That's just like balderdash.
The main thing that I do, and the thing is, it really takes quite a bit of nervous, emotional, intellectual energy to write. It does. And you sit down in front of the computer today and you sort of stare at the screen. And what I have learned to do is just write something. Just write a goddamn sentence and keep going. And once you start writing, I find that at least for me, it tends to flow pretty smoothly once I get rolling. But you gotta make yourself do it.
Yeah. Well, that's very good advice. I think that's actually important advice for the aspiring writer. So have you found that forums or conventions or media have been any advantage or any of those things have been of help for you?
Yeah, there's two reasons to go to conventions, and one reason not to do it, and it drives me nuts when I see writers doing it, is don't do it to, quote, promote your work, because it's a fool's errand. You will always spend more money promoting your work than you will boost in the way of extra sales. Even if you're, an author who you're the guest of honor and they're paying your way out there, which I've often been, that's great, except I'm going to lose somewhere between 5 and 6 days worth of work going to a convention, even if it doesn't cost me anything, but it means I'm not writing for 5 or 6 days, and I'm losing quite a bit of money on that end. So don't do it to promote your work. I mean, as long as you're there, you can do some promotional work, but that's not the reason to do it. The main reason to go to conventions is two things. One of it is just psychological for me, at least, which is that, like I said, my job is to go down the basement and talk to myself all day. And I find that periodically going out into the real world and talking to people I don't know and I didn't invent them and I don't know what they're going to say is just good for me. But the other reason to do it is over time you will build a professional network. And the thing about that kind of network is it's completely unpredictable how it will wind up paying off. But I've never known it not to, sooner or later. Just you get to know people. And
that makes sense.
And I think it's just good for writers psychologically. There are some writers who just are sort of kind of naturally hermits and don't want to do it. And that's okay. But I find it's good for my mental health.
Okay, good. That makes sense. Thank you very much for that. So now for someone who's not familiar with your writings, what do you recommend as an Eric Flint primer?
1632 is my most popular book, so I would, and it's a very good novel. So I would, that's one. Another one I think is very good, which is it's an enjoyable read, is a novel called Boundary, which I wrote with Reichs for. And it's the first of a series of novels. So if you like it, you'll have things to go with. I've written a lot of novels with Dave Freer. And what I might recommend there would be to start with Pyramid Scheme, which is kind of it's sort of David Mai's homage to L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt's Incompleted Shanner stories. It's kind of lighthearted fantasy, and it's, I think, very good. My first novel is a very good novel, Mother of Demons. And I wrote a novel with Kathy Wentworth. I'm very proud of it. I think it's a really good novel. It's a straight science fiction novel called The Course of Empire. And that would be another one I could recommend. And, there are others, but I think I gave you 5.
That's a good opening line. Yeah, I mean, obviously you don't write bad books, but just a way to start to get familiar with you.
Yeah.
So now, how do people find you on the internet?
I just, you can find me on Facebook. I have an active Facebook page. I'm there pretty regularly. I have my own website, but I'm less active. I mean, I don't show up there anywhere near as often as I do on Facebook. Probably Facebook is the best place. It's just quick and easy for me to do it.
So just Eric Flint on Facebook?
Yeah, just Eric Flint.
Or is it Eric Flint 1632 or something like that? Or is it just Eric Flint?
My personal Facebook page is just Eric Flint. I know I also have an author page, but I don't actually run those. It's
okay.
Sort of my minions do.
Okay.
But so Facebook's one way. Baines Bar is another. You can go to Baines' website. I show up there also.
Well, that's good. So Facebook, I mean, pretty much everybody's going to be able to find you out there.
I'm posting there several times a week.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much for this interview, Eric. It's been...
I appreciate you inviting me.
Yes. And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah,